I don't talk about this often. In fact, there are people in this very family who've never heard what I'm about to tell you. Your grandmother used to say I should let it go. She'd say, "Harold, some things are better left where you buried them." But I'm getting old now, and old men run out of reasons to keep quiet. So sit down, turn that television off, and listen carefully, because I'm only going to tell this once. It was the winter of 1973. I was 24 years old, working a night shift at a cold storage facility just outside of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing glamorous, mind you. Just me and a clipboard, walking aisles of frozen goods, making sure temperatures were logged, making sure everything stayed still. That job taught me one thing above all else, that silence has a texture. You can feel it pressing against your ears, heavy and thick, the way silence only ever gets when something is listening right alongside you. Now, in those days, I shared an apartment on the third floor of a building on Broad Street. Old place, built sometime in the 30s, I think. Radiators that clanked and hissed like something alive behind the walls. The hallway always smelled of boiled cabbage and cigarette smoke from old Mr. Vasquez on the second floor. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have set a man on edge. But something was already off, even before it happened. I'd been feeling it for about 3 days prior. That feeling, you know the one, where the hairs on the back of your neck rise, and you turn around, and there's nothing there. Just the room. Just the ordinary, familiar room. And somehow, that makes it worse. I'd come off a double shift on a Thursday night. Must have been close to 2 in the morning when I climbed those stairs. My boots were heavy, my eyes were burning. I remember thinking about nothing except the mattress and how I was going to fall into it like a stone into a river. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, hung my coat on the hook, and stood in the kitchen for a minute, drinking water straight from the tap. That's when I heard it. A knock. 3 knocks, to be exact. Slow, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart that each one felt considered, like whatever was doing the knocking wanted to make absolutely sure you heard each one individually. Knock, knock, knock. I stood there with the glass halfway to my lips. It was 2 in the morning. Nobody knocks at 2 in the morning. Not on a Thursday. Not in that building. Old Mr. Vasquez was half deaf and in bed by 9. The apartment across the hall had been empty for 6 weeks since the young couple moved out. I told myself it was the pipes, the radiator, the building settling the way old buildings do when the temperature drops below freezing outside. I told myself all of that. And then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Same rhythm, same deliberate, patient spacing, like it knew I was standing right there, like it was giving me time to decide. I set the glass down, walked to the door, put my hand on the deadbolt, and stopped. There was something about the quality of those knocks. They weren't urgent. They weren't frantic the way you'd knock if there was an emergency. They were calm, too calm. Calm in the way a person is calm when they already know exactly how things are going to go. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Now, any sensible man would have gone to bed right then, written it off, maybe laughed about it in the morning over coffee and eggs. But I'd lived long enough, even at 24, to know that some things you can't unfeel. And what I felt standing at that door was not relief. I stepped back, turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark of my own apartment, and listened. For a long time, nothing. Then, very softly, from just outside my door, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, I heard breathing, slow and steady,
patient, the kind of breathing that belongs to someone who has all the time in the world, the kind that tells you they're not afraid, that they've done this before. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair facing the door with every light in the apartment blazing. I called in sick for my Friday shift, spent the next morning convincing myself that the city gets strange noises and that thin walls carry sounds in unpredictable directions, and that I was an exhausted man who'd worked 90 hours that week and my mind was playing tricks on me. By afternoon, I almost believed it. Then, my neighbor, a woman named Ruth who lived at the end of the hall, knocked on my door. And God help me, for just a half second before I opened it, my whole body went rigid with fear. Ruth said she'd heard the knocking too, 3 nights running. She'd assumed it was me coming home late, but the knocking she'd heard hadn't come from my door. It had come from the empty apartment across the hall. She said the sound had woken her at the same time each night, 2:15 in the morning. She'd looked through her own peephole each time. She'd seen the same thing I had. Nothing, just an empty hallway. Ruth was not a dramatic woman. She was 61 years old, a retired school teacher, and the kind of person who kept a planner and alphabetized her spice rack. When she told me the story, she held her coffee cup in both hands and spoke in a very quiet, very controlled voice. And that careful, deliberate control frightened me more than anything else so far, because it told me that Ruth was working very hard not to let herself think too deeply about what she had heard. I called the building superintendent that evening, a fellow by the name of Dennis Holt. I told him the apartment across the hall seemed to have some kind of issue and asked when it was last inspected. He told me it had been sealed since the last tenant vacated. He said, and this part I remember precisely, "That apartment's been locked, Harold. Nobody's been in or out. I checked the lock myself last Tuesday." I asked him if he could check it again. There was a pause on the line. A long, uncomfortable pause. Then Dennis said, very quietly, "I'll come Monday."
He came Monday morning. I stood in the hallway while he worked the lock. Ruth stood behind me. The door swung open and the cold that came out of that apartment hit us like something physical. Not the cold of a room that's merely unheated. Something sharper than that. Something purposeful. The apartment was empty. No furniture, bare floors, dust on every surface, except in the dust, just inside the threshold, there were marks, faint but unmistakable, the kind of marks that a person makes when they stand very still in one place for a very long time. 2 slight impressions, side by side, right in front of the door, as if something had been standing there, facing outward. Dennis didn't say anything. He just stared at those marks for a long moment, and then he stepped back and closed the door and locked it again. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. The knocking stopped after that. I never heard it again. Neither did Ruth. I moved out the following spring. Nothing dramatic, I told myself. I just wanted a nicer place, more light, a shorter commute. But the truth is I never once stopped thinking about those marks in the dust, about the breathing I'd heard through a closed door, about the fact that whatever had been standing in that room had been facing outward, waiting patiently, silently, in the dark. That is what has never left me, children. Not the knocking itself, but the patience of it, the absolute unhurried certainty of it, as if whatever was out there already knew, had always known that eventually the door would open. Now, you can go to bed, and if anything wakes you tonight, don't go to the door.